Now, if you guys follow the channel, you'll know that we've covered the Impossible port series before. Games like Resident Evil 2 on the N64, Doom on the SNES, The Witcher on the Nintendo Switch, to name a couple. But today we're going to take a look at probably the most fascinating and interesting port I've ever seen, and that is Tomb Raider, the original 3D version from 1996, running on the Game Boy Advance. This is Tomb Raider running on the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Yes, there are already Tomb Raider games on the GBA, but these are 2D games, and while they're pretty good, let's be clear, we are talking about the classic 3D action-adventure game that launched on the PC, Sega Saturn, and Sony PlayStation all the way back in 1996. This version running on the GBA is known as OpenLara, and we will get to the name and more about the project shortly. But for those that may be wondering, what you're seeing here is me running the game all on a stock GBA via an EverDrive cart. There are no other tricks or magic here, just the ROM and the hardware, and it's pretty impressive. So let's dive in and take a look at this in more detail. OpenLara began 5 years ago as a reverse engineering project for the original Tomb Raider game, with its initial focus on modern hardware with a modern GPU. It's a cross-platform open source implementation of the Tomb Raider engine, and there's even a web browser capable version that you can try out as well. OpenLara is certainly not anything new if you follow the homebrew circles. The engine is available on many platforms including the Raspberry Pi, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation Vita, original Xbox, and many others. But the GBA version brings many questions. Just exactly how does the GBA manage to pull this off? As a quick comparison, let's first take a look at the GBA version running against the Sony PlayStation 1 and the Nokia N-Gage version of Tomb Raider. The PS1 comes with dedicated 3D geometry rendering and featured garage shading in its hardware, and its main CPU, the R3000, runs at 33.86 MHz and has a 1 MB frame buffer. The Nokia N-Gage features an ARM4T architecture and runs at 104 MHz. The Nintendo GBA runs a 32-bit ARM7 TDMI at 16.78 MHz and has a resolution of 240 by 160 pixels and 96 kilobytes of VRAM. On paper, the GBA really has no business running Tomb Raider, but the game certainly holds its own. Its frame rate can get a little choppy at times, but it's certainly playable even on the tiny GBA handheld. OpenLara developer, known as XProger, has pulled off the impossible, and of course I had to learn more about it, so I reached out to him to understand exactly how this port was achieved. It starts in June of 2021. During the development of OpenLara, XProger was unhappy with the project. He felt like that it had diverted too much away from the original behaviors of the original game, and set out to re-architect and rebuild the logic of the original engine to be as accurate as possible, effectively rewriting most of the OpenLara engine. The goals were to be as close to the original gameplay as possible, with the original behaviors of enemies, shooting, and damage calculations. To test this rewrite, he would set himself some pretty hefty milestones, and the first of those would be to port the game to older platforms, which would include the Panasonic 3DO and the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Fellow YouTuber Hard4Games showed off an alpha version of OpenLara running on the 3DO at the end of last year, but the GBA version would present an entirely different challenge. With no dedicated 3D hardware, OpenLara on the GBA was done entirely in software using the CPU. When I asked about the feasibility of the GBA for the port, XProger was initially interested in the GBA because of its interesting homebrew development scene and the potential that it had. Initial proof of concepts were made with the engine running at around 10 frames per second without any gameplay or objects on the level, and this is where he began to optimize code, and thanks to the very fine GBA dev community, he was able to get the game running faster by optimizing and iterating, and some of these optimizations would take full advantage of the GBA hardware. The biggest performance gain would be rewriting critical parts of the code in ARM assembly and this would provide a 40% increase in performance. Additionally, the Game Boy Advance lacks any support for native floating point numbers and integer division, and for this, pre-calculated division lookup tables would be used and placed in the GBA's work RAM known as EWRAM. EWRAM would be used to also store additional lookup tables and important object data. EWRAM, however, is external RAM. In other words, it's not on the same chip as the CPU. This means that it's sitting on a 16-bit bus. But there's also another type of RAM known as IWRAM. This is the internal work RAM, which is on the same chip as the CPU. Some of the lookup tables and other critical parts of code, including the math functions and sound mixing functions, were stored in IRAM exclusively. One of the most critical features of the game is the light map array, and this is the 32 variations of shading from a 256 color palette. The light map array is placed at the base address of IWRAM. This means that a load instruction in assembly language can be saved, because the base address is already known. This is also done for additional lookup tables. For example, the division lookup table is stored at the base address in EWRAM. Again, this means that the developer can save one LDR instruction. And it's these micro optimizations that start to add up and really affect the performance in the right direction. But let's move on and talk about the graphics. All the rasterization is done in software on the CPU as mentioned, and the game uses the native Mode 4 resolution on the GBA. This is a fully bitmap mode running at 240 by 160 with an 8-bit color palette and supporting page flipping. Earlier versions of the engine would use the GBA Mode 5, which was 128 by 160 that was cropped to 120 by 160 and scaled horizontally. This mode would offer better performance, but unfortunately the resolution looks much worse, and some of the comparison shots will show the difference. So in the end, the developer would settle on Mode 4. Many optimizations were also done on the 3D viewport. Polygons were clipped before rasterization and uses less range in the division table with skips and checks for each scan line. Additionally, there is no Z buffer that's being used in this port. Instead, the developer uses the painter's algorithm, which is a simple algorithm to determine which polygons should be visible and the ones that should be removed from the viewport. By removing polygons that will never be visible in the viewport, this can not only increase performance, but it also leaves additional memory available to do other important tasks. But the polygons are not sorted by camera distance. Instead, an ordering table is used, and this is very similar to the PlayStation GPU, which is designed to walk through a linked list of graphics primitives and draw each one in sequence until it reaches the end of the list. XProger is continuing to perform micro optimizations to the code, but there's also a high-level optimization that's planned that should overall improve performance quite significantly. You see, the current version of OpenLara that you see here has the same data as the PC version of the original Tomb Raider game. This means that textures don't have reduced resolutions and there is no reduction in geometry detail. The only real difference is the view distance has been reduced. Some outside rooms and behind windows of the home level have been turned off, and some static mesh plants were also turned off as well, but everything else is pretty much the same as the original version. This means that each level can be carefully profiled with alterations to assets to take full advantage of the GBA's architecture and limitations. The full audio soundtrack, including all sound effects, are included in the game. What this means is that sound mixing will also take CPU cycles away from the 3D rendering and gameplay loop. The GBA hardware supports 2 PCM 8-bit channels, but in OpenLara, only one of the channel is used to mix 4 active channels plus the music track into it, all via software, with the mixing routine stored in IWRAM. Now for those people interested, I will leave a link to the ROM in the description below where you can download and try it out for yourself. It will work on original GBA hardware, a reputable GBA emulator like MGBA for example, as well as clone systems like the Analog Pocket as you see behind me. Any one of those three things will work just fine, so try it out for yourself. Now I will say that this is not the complete version of Tomb Raider or OpenLara. Right now it's only exclusively done for the first 3 demos. In other words, you get the first 2 levels of the game and including Lara's house. Now when I asked the developer whether it would be feasible to fit the entire contents of the game onto the GBA, he said it would be. He is confident that the full game, all the levels, including the FMV, could potentially fit onto a 32 megabyte GBA ROM cartridge, and that is pretty impressive. We'll just have to wait and see if and when that actually eventuates, but that is a very promising piece of information that the developer has let us know about. Now, before I go, I also want to be very clear about this because some people on Twitter were talking about whether there's some type of FPGA wizardry going on, or maybe there's a Raspberry Pi involved. This is nothing but code running on the GBA hardware. There's nothing in the middle that's helping this game push polygons or its frame rate faster than it normally does. So this again is just a real piece of technical wizardry and fantastic optimization that does take advantage of the GBA strengths and really understands its limitations as well. And potentially now maybe we'll start to see ports to older systems, you know, things like the Commodore Amiga with a suitable 68060 processor, for example, really start to, you know, cross my mind whether we can start to see ports to older hardware and have them run at a good level of performance just in the same way as the GBA version. But we are going to leave it here for this episode. Let me know what you think about Tomb Raider running on the GBA. I still quite can't believe it when I sit down and start playing it. It's just an amazing port, and I can't wait to see where this goes. And we'll definitely continue to cover this on the channel as things progress. But for now, we are going to leave it here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.